Good evening and welcome in. Tonight it feels as though we are standing at a quiet doorway just before entering an older world, one shaped by incense smoke, linen robes, cool stone halls, and the slow light of the Nile. We will spend this peaceful time with the priests of Egypt, those people who served the temples, cared for sacred spaces, and helped keep a civilization's religious life moving in measured, careful rhythms. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, you may like to subscribe and return whenever you want another calm visit into history. And if you feel like leaving a comment, you could share where you are listening from tonight or which ancient subject you might like to wander through next. Settle in now in whatever way feels comfortable. Let the room become softer around you. Let the day drift farther away. There is no need to hold on to anything urgent here. We are only going to listen slowly as the story opens into temple courtyards, offering tables, sacred texts, and the quiet work of those who lived near the gods. And so, with the doorway gently opened, we can begin with the world those priests inhabited and let the details come forward at an easy, restful pace. The priests of Egypt belonged to a world in which religion was not separate from the ordinary business of government, labor, and record-keeping. In many periods of Egyptian history, temple service was part of a much larger administrative system. A temple was not only a place for prayer, and not even only a place for sacrifice in the later sense. It could also function as a storehouse for grain, a workshop for artisans, a library of texts and instructions, and a center where offerings, land, and accounts were carefully managed. Priests helped keep all of that in order. Their work reached beyond devotion and into the practical care of sacred property, agricultural produce, and the many goods that moved through temple life. In that sense, the temple was less like a quiet shrine set apart from the world, and more like a living institution with many quiet rooms, many duties, and many hands. In the Egyptian imagination, the gods did not remain far away in some abstract distance. They were believed to be present in images, sacred names, statues, and ritual forms that human beings tended with great care. A temple statue was not merely decoration. It was treated as a living focus of divine presence, even if the exact nature of that presence is still debated by scholars in careful and nuanced ways. Priests acted as the attentive middle layer between the divine and the human world. They washed the image, clothed it in fine linen, anointed it with oils and perfumes, and presented food and incense according to ritual custom. These actions were not casual gestures. They were part of the maintenance of Ma'at, the Egyptian ideal of truth, balance, justice, and proper order. Ma'at was understood as the pattern that held the universe together. To care for a god properly was, in a symbolic and religious sense, to help prevent the world from sliding into confusion. So the priest's work was both humble and cosmic, both practical and deeply sacred. A priest in Egypt did not necessarily live every day in an isolated sacred life, cut off from all other concerns. In fact, many priests had additional roles, and temple service could be organized in rotations rather than as a permanent full-time residence in the way modern people might imagine. Some priests were farmers when they were not on duty. Some were scribes, officials, or land managers. Others may have held family obligations, local offices, or specialized jobs connected to the temple economy. This flexibility matters because it reminds us that ancient Egyptian priesthood was a social role as much as a spiritual one. It was not always a secluded calling withdrawn from everyday life. Instead, the temple was woven into the town, the field, the storage yard, and the court. The sacred and the practical were not separate realms so much as neighboring currents flowing through the same landscape. The clothing of priests also reflected ideas of purity, restraint, and ritual readiness. Linen was favored because it was light, clean, and symbolically appropriate for sacred service. In the heat of Egypt, it also had the practical advantage of being cool and workable. Wool, by contrast, was often avoided in sacred settings, at least in many periods and contexts, because it carried different associations and could be seen as less pure. Priests were often depicted with shaven heads or carefully maintained hair, and that appearance itself signaled discipline and separation from ordinary labor. The pale fabric, the clean lines of dress, and the serious grooming created a distinct visual identity. In reliefs and paintings, this could make priests seem almost weightless against the bright temple walls, as if they had stepped into a quieter register of life. Some priests specialized in reciting sacred words, and these spoken formulas were themselves a form of action. Others prepared incense, handled oils, or performed music with sistrums, flutes, or chant. Some cared for the temple estate, the food supply, or the storage of ritual goods. Others maintained the calendar, keeping track of feast days, sacred festivals, and the correct sequence of rites. A great temple needed many hands, and priesthood was broad enough to include a wide range of expertise. This is one reason the subject remains so rich and interesting to historians. Priesthood in Egypt was not one single office with one uniform task. It was more like a whole sacred ecosystem, with many ranks, many functions, and many specialized forms of knowledge that had to work together in harmony. Even the timing of ritual mattered with great care. Temple work often began early, before the heat of the day became heavy and before ordinary noise filled the streets. The first light of morning was a fitting moment for awakening the god's image, opening the shrine, and renewing the day's sacred order. There is something deeply human in this rhythm. Before the sun climbed high, before merchants called out and animals stirred and workers began their tasks, the temple settled into a quiet sequence of gestures that tied the new day to a larger cosmic pattern. In this way, priestly service followed the broader rhythm of the river and the sky, of flood and harvest, dawn and dusk, the predictable turning of time that ancient Egyptians observed so closely. The priests also lived within an environment of sacred geography, and the structure of the temple itself shaped the feeling of their work. A temple might be aligned with the sun or placed in relation to older sacred sites, river approaches, or processional routes. It could include pylons, courtyards, hypostyle halls, side chambers, storerooms, and inner sanctuaries that became increasingly restricted as one moved inward. The experience of walking through such a space could feel like moving not only through architecture, but through levels of concentration. The outer court was broader and more public, while the inner rooms became quieter, darker, and more charged with meaning. In that arrangement, stone and shadow helped express religious ideas. The building itself taught a visitor that sanctity could be approached gradually, by steps and thresholds, by patience and attention. And so, before looking more closely at individual duties and ranks, it helps to see the priesthood as a bridge between the celestial and the earthly, between rituals that seemed timeless and the ordinary work of feeding a temple household. It was a world of linen and incense, of accounting tablets and sacred songs, of carefully measured offerings and carefully observed silence. From there, we can wander gently into the first morning tasks, where sacred routines began in near silence and the temple stirred into life. The first task of the day was often the opening of the shrine, a moment that had both practical and symbolic importance. In the dimness of the inner sanctuary, the cult statue would be approached as though waking a presence that had rested through the night. Doors were opened, seals were broken, and the air of the shrine was renewed with incense, cool water, and spoken formulae. For the priest, this was not theatrical performance in the modern sense. It was a disciplined sequence of acts believed to restore contact between the divine image and the ordered world outside. The careful repetition of these steps gave the day a steady beginning, as if the morning itself needed to be reminded that it had truly arrived. To an observer, the scene might have seemed soft and understated. There would be the faint smell of resin smoke, the rustle of linen, the sound of footsteps on stone, and the low murmur of liturgy. Egyptian ritual often favored exactness over spectacle. Small details mattered: the position of the hands, the direction of movement, the freshness of the water, the cleanliness of the vessel, the correct words in the correct order. The quiet precision was part of the power. In a culture where order was sacred, doing a thing properly was itself a form of devotion. Priests also handled offerings with care, and offerings were more than simple gifts. Bread, beer, vegetables, fruit, incense, ointments, and sometimes meat or fowl were brought before the god according to temple custom. These offerings sustained not only the ritual image, but the broader temple household, since what was presented to the deity could later be redistributed among priests and workers according to established rules. The circulation of food through the temple was one of the ways the sacred institution remained materially alive. In that sense, the movement of offerings linked the invisible and visible parts of society. A loaf of bread could pass from field to granary to altar to priestly table, carrying with it the labor of many people and the blessing of a structured religious world. The maintenance of purity was another major concern. Priests washed frequently, avoided certain activities before ritual service, and observed restrictions that marked them off from ordinary life while on duty. Purity in ancient Egyptian religion did not always mean moral purity in the modern sense. It often concerned ritual cleanliness, proper preparation, and separation from conditions seen as unsuitable for approaching divine power. This could include washing, shaving, changing clothes, and avoiding specific foods or substances depending on the period and role. The body itself became part of the ritual instrument. A clean body, like a clean shrine, was a fitting place for ordered action. The temple calendar gave priestly life a recurring rhythm. Some days were ordinary service days, while others were feast days or festival occasions when the god's statue might be carried in procession, placed in a shrine bark, or brought into contact with a wider public. These festivals were often lively and emotionally meaningful, though the surviving records sometimes describe them in formal terms. For local people, such events could be among the most vivid religious experiences of the year. They brought sacred presence out from the deepest interior of the temple and into courtyards, avenues, and sometimes the streets beyond. The priesthood therefore moved between hiddenness and display, between private ritual and public celebration. It is also worth remembering that the priesthood of Egypt changed over time. The Egypt of the Old Kingdom was not identical to the Egypt of the New Kingdom, and temple institutions evolved across centuries. Titles, duties, and ranks could differ from one era to another. Some offices became more prominent, while others changed meaning or were absorbed into larger systems. Scholars still debate the exact functions of certain priestly titles because the surviving records are uneven and often ceremonial in style. That uncertainty is part of the historical texture. The world of the priests is not a neat diagram, but a long, layered tradition with local customs, dynastic shifts, and regional differences. For all of that complexity, one image stays steady: a figure moving quietly through stone corridors before sunrise, carrying water, incense, or cloth, preparing the temple for the day. There is calm in that image and a kind of ancient focus. The work was repetitive, but repetition was not emptiness. Repetition was how the gods were served and how the world was thought to remain in balance. The temple itself was also a place of memory. Its walls preserved names, gifts, genealogies, and records of endowments. Priests might oversee texts that described ritual gestures, hymns, or the proper sequence of offerings. Some were trained in reading and writing, which gave the priesthood a strong connection to the scribal tradition. In many cases, literacy was a highly valued skill, and priests helped preserve the knowledge that kept the temple functioning over long periods of time. A temple library, or archives associated with it, could hold sacred compositions, lists of festivals, business accounts, and administrative notes. Such records linked the present to the past. They allowed the same rites to be performed year after year with continuity and confidence. There was also a social side to priestly life that can be easy to overlook. Priests were not merely abstract holy men. They belonged to families, neighborhoods, and patronage networks. Office could be inherited or connected to status, though not always in a simple or direct way. Some priestly positions may have been highly desirable because they brought prestige, food shares, and access to temple resources. Others may have been demanding and carefully regulated. The institution could support households while also placing them under obligations of service. In this way, priesthood sat at the meeting point of devotion, economy, and social rank. It was both a calling and a career, both an honor and a responsibility. When one imagines the Egyptian priesthood with patience, it becomes less like a single image and more like a whole climate. There is the clean scent of linen, the low light within a shrine, the measured sound of ritual speech, the rustle of papyrus and account lists, the warmth of stored grain, the coolness of stone underfoot. There is also the deeper idea that all of these things mattered because they helped preserve a world in proper relation to the divine. And that may be the quiet heart of the subject, not just priests serving gods, but a civilization arranging itself day after day around the conviction that careful action could help keep heaven and earth in balance. A typical temple morning may have begun with purification, because purity was one of the foundations of priestly life in ancient Egypt. Before a priest entered the sacred precincts, the body had to be prepared in a way that was at once practical, symbolic, and deeply traditional. Water, natron, and careful washing helped remove the marks of ordinary life before approaching the god's dwelling place. In a hot, dusty environment, cleanliness had an obvious physical value, but for the Egyptians it meant something more than hygiene. It signaled readiness. It marked the body as fit for sacred service, and it created a kind of invisible boundary between the everyday world and the divine space beyond the temple doors. In this sense, purification was not just an opening gesture. It was the priest stepping gradually out of common time and into ritual time, where every movement mattered, and even the skin could become part of the ceremonial order. Many priests shaved their heads and bodies regularly, and this too was connected with purity. Hair could be seen as bringing the world outside the temple into the sacred chambers, gathering dust, oil, and the traces of daily life. A clean-shaven appearance therefore carried a ritual meaning that went beyond style or discipline. It represented careful removal, a deliberate simplification of the self. Some ancient images and later descriptions suggest that priests appeared almost austere, with smooth skin and restrained clothing, as though they had set aside personal ornament in favor of sacred function. There may also have been practical reasons for this grooming in the climate of Egypt, where heat and insects were constant concerns, yet the ritual aspect remained central. To shave was not merely to be neat, it was to become suitable, temporarily at least, for contact with divine presence. The body itself was treated as part of the temple equipment, a living surface that had to be prepared with the same care as linen, oil, or incense. One important priestly duty was opening the shrine, a ritual act that can feel almost intimate when described closely. The god's statue, or cult image, was usually kept in an inner sanctuary where only authorized priests could enter. To the ordinary worshipper, this hidden chamber remained unseen, and the god's presence was mediated through offerings, procession, and public ritual. But within the sanctuary, priests performed acts that symbolically awakened the deity for the day. They opened the doors, cleansed the image, dressed it in fresh linen, and presented food, drink, and incense. These actions were not understood as empty theater. They were treated as real service to a divine being who needed attention, honor, and sustenance. The morning ritual may have reflected older ideas about household care as well, since a divine statue could be imagined in some ways as a living resident of the temple. In the cool stillness of the inner chamber, the careful handling of the image would have been slow and exact, guided by inherited formulas, and a sense that the world's order was being renewed one gesture at a time. Offerings were not random gifts. They followed precise rules, and the quality of bread, beer, meat, fruit, and perfume mattered in visible and invisible ways. Egyptian temples were not only houses of worship, they were also economic institutions, storehouses, workshops, and centers of redistribution. So when a priest presented food to a god, the act belonged to several systems at once. It was devotion, but it was also management, accounting, and social order. The temple received goods from estates, labor, and endowments, and sacred offerings could later be redistributed to priests and personnel according to rank and service. In that sense, the offering table was not just an image of abundance. It was part of a real, organized flow of resources, yet the symbolic side remained essential. The god received the best of what the temple could provide, the most carefully prepared and ritually pure items, because divine favor was thought to depend on correct attention. Even the arrangement of loaves, jars, and cuts of meat could matter. The offering was a statement that the temple household remained prosperous, disciplined, and capable of maintaining the cosmic relationship between deity and community. The smell of incense likely played a large role in the atmosphere of the temple. In the dry heat of Egypt, fragrance could feel both practical and ceremonial, giving the sacred space a distinct sensory identity. Incense rose in curls and streams, visible enough to be noticed and subtle enough to vanish quickly, which may be one reason it became such a powerful ritual medium. It marked a place as different from the ordinary world. Where people outside might smell dust, sweat, animals, and the riverbank, the temple could carry the scent of resins, herbs, and carefully prepared smoke. That contrast would have mattered. It trained the senses toward reverence and separation. Burning incense also created a kind of upward movement, a visible plume rising into the air like a sign that devotion itself could travel beyond the human level. Ancient texts and temple imagery suggest that incense was associated with purification, divine welcome, and the pleasing of the gods, though the exact uses probably varied from temple to temple and from one deity to another. Still, the basic effect must have been memorable. The temple air itself would have seemed transformed, thick with fragrance and expectation. Priestly recitation was equally important, though its power was quieter and perhaps even more exacting. Sacred words were spoken or chanted at key moments, often according to formulas preserved by tradition and repeated with careful consistency. In ancient Egyptian religion, words were not merely descriptions of reality. They were believed to act on reality. To pronounce a name correctly could help sustain its presence. To recite a ritual formula in the proper order could keep a ceremony effective. This is one reason Egyptian religious language can seem so dense and formal when compared with everyday speech. It was a language shaped by use, memory, and authority. Some prayers and liturgical texts may have been transmitted for generations with only gradual changes. In the temple, the priest's voice had to carry clarity as well as meaning. A recitation might accompany the opening of a shrine, the presentation of offerings, or the purification of a sacred object. Silence mattered too, but speech was a carefully measured tool. It was not casual conversation. It was a means of maintaining a living relationship between visible and invisible powers. Even now, in the surviving inscriptions, one can sense how tightly the Egyptians linked sound, order, and sacred effectiveness. Some priests were known especially for musical roles, and this adds another layer of texture to temple life. Sistrums, flutes, clappers, drums, and chanting may all have appeared in ritual contexts, particularly in processions or ceremonies for certain deities. Sound in ancient Egypt was not decorative in a modern sense. It had ritual force. It helped shape the sacred experience the way incense shaped the air and linen shaped the body. A sistrum, with its bright rattling frame, could produce a lively, shimmering sound associated with divine joy and protection. Chanting might mark movement through temple courts or accompany the arrival of a cult statue in public view. Music could awaken a god, honor a goddess, or create a controlled burst of energy within an otherwise disciplined setting. There is some uncertainty in the details because the surviving evidence is uneven and often filtered through images, titles, and ritual texts rather than full musical notation. But it seems clear that sound was part of the temple's emotional and symbolic architecture. It gave shape to transitions, helping priests move from quiet preparation to active ceremony and then back again into stillness. One can imagine how repetitive and composed the life of a priest might have felt, with the same gestures repeated day after day. And yet repetition was not emptiness. In Egyptian thought, regular ritual helped sustain the world itself. This is one of the most striking ideas in the religion of pharaonic Egypt. That order had to be continually maintained, not simply assumed. The daily rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the stability of kingship, and the balance of the cosmos all belonged to a broader pattern of endurance that demanded human participation. The priest's measured act, done correctly each time, had cosmic significance. A libation poured at the right moment, a shrine opened in the right sequence, a prayer spoken with the right words. These were not small tasks. They were ways of helping the universe remain coherent. That may sound immense, and it was. But the daily reality was often very simple. A hand lifting linen, a mouth speaking formulae, a vessel placed with care, a room kept clean, a flame fed, a door opened. The scale of meaning grew out of the scale of attention. That is part of what makes priestly life so absorbing to study. It was deeply practical, highly symbolic, and quietly immense all at once. The priests were not detached mystics living apart from ordinary concerns. They belonged to a structured institution with schedules, rules, property, duties, and ranks. At the same time, they worked in a world where every action could be read as meaningful beyond itself. Their routine was both administrative and sacred, both human and cosmological. Modern readers often look for dramatic ceremonies or famous names, but much of priestly life was likely built from repetition, discipline, and ordinary maintenance. A temple only functioned because many small things were done correctly, day after day. The calm persistence of that labor may be what gave the priesthood its enduring authority. And as the morning rituals settled, another layer of the priestly world appeared. Ranks, titles, and specialized roles that gave shape to the temple household. In many Egyptian temples, the priestly role was not a single fixed identity, but a cycle of duties that shifted through the month and the year. A man could be a ritual servant on one day, a reciter on another, and then return to ordinary life outside the sanctuary. This helped keep the temple world carefully ordered, but it also made priesthood feel almost seasonal, as if sacred service came in tides. The great rituals were deeply formal, yet the men who performed them were often embedded in families, neighborhoods, and local obligations. We can picture the quiet movement between these spheres, the cool stone corridors of the temple, the smell of natron and incense, the return home at dusk, and the long interval before the next appointed rite. In this way, priestly life in Egypt was not always a permanent withdrawal from the world. It could be a patterned alternation, a rhythm of sacred work and ordinary time that reflected the Egyptians' wider sense that order itself depended on recurring acts. One of the most fascinating features of Egyptian priestly service is that it was often divided into phylae, or groups that rotated responsibility. This meant that not every priest served every day. Instead, duties were distributed in turns, perhaps to reduce strain and to ensure that the temple remained supplied with trained personnel across the month. The system also created a sense of careful administration, almost like the temple was a living organism with many hands, each arriving at its proper time. Ancient documents suggest that these rotations could be detailed and bureaucratic, with records of attendance, offerings, and labor. Such evidence gives us a glimpse of the temple not merely as a spiritual center, but as a managed institution. One can imagine the quiet precision of this schedule. names written down on papyrus, assignments remembered, vessels cleaned, garments stored, and then the next group arriving to take up the sacred burden. The rotation made priestly life more communal, but also more disciplined, because each man belonged to a larger system that never paused. Egyptian priests were expected to maintain exceptional standards of purity, and this affected nearly every part of daily routine. Purity was not simply a moral idea in the modern sense. It was a ritual state, carefully preserved through washing, shaving, clean linen, dietary restrictions, and the avoidance of anything considered contaminating. Many priests shaved their bodies, including their heads, so that no impurity could cling to them. Linen garments were preferred because linen was associated with cleanliness and with the light, restrained atmosphere of sacred service. Certain foods, especially those considered too strong or too tied to the world of decay, may have been limited at specific times. Water, in this context, was not just practical but ceremonial, a means of re-entering order before approaching the divine image. It is easy to imagine the early hours inside a temple complex, the splash of water in basin after basin, the brush of linen against skin, the soft rustle of cloth, and the sense that even the body had to be prepared like a ritual object. Such routines remind us that Egyptian priesthood was as much about disciplined embodiment as about prayer. Another important aspect of priestly life was the care of the divine statue, which in many temples was treated as the living presence of the god. The priest did not simply look after an image in the modern museum sense. Instead, he participated in a sequence of acts that mirrored the care given to a king or a revered elder. The god was washed, clothed, anointed, adorned with jewelry, and offered food, all according to exact tradition. This daily service transformed the temple chamber into a place of intimate contact with the divine, though only a few were allowed inside. The statue itself may have been small, hidden in a shrine, and only gradually revealed as ritual doors opened and closed. Scholars still debate how much the Egyptians understood this image as the god's actual body versus a symbolic vessel of presence, but what is clear is the seriousness of the act. To feed the god was to keep cosmic balance alive. To fail in the ritual would not merely be negligence, it might be a disruption of the relationship between heaven, earth, and the hidden powers that sustained both. Priests also served as readers and reciters of sacred words, and in Egypt the spoken formula had real force. These specialists, often called lector priests in modern scholarship, were responsible for reciting hymns, spells, and ritual texts at the appropriate moment. In a culture that valued written sacred language immensely, the exact words mattered. A phrase misplaced or a gesture delayed could change the rhythm of the rite. The lector priest was therefore more than a speaker. He was a keeper of memory, a guardian of tradition, and in some settings a kind of ritual technician whose voice activated the ceremony. His presence would have given the temple an audible texture, chants echoing against stone, formulas murmured in steady cadence, the rustle of papyrus, the occasional pause before a crucial line. Some texts suggest that these recitations were connected with healing, protection, or magical defense as well as temple worship. In Egyptian thought, the boundaries between religion, ritual power, and healing were often porous. The spoken word itself could be a bridge between human intention and divine action, and the priest's voice was one of the most important instruments in the temple. Although priests are sometimes imagined as remote and solemn, many Egyptian priests also took part in music and performance. Women often served in temple music roles, and some male priests were involved in singing, clapping, or playing instruments during ceremonies and festivals. These performances were not entertainment in the modern sense, but offerings of sound and rhythm. A sistrum shaken in the temple air, a drum tapped in measured beats, a choir of voices rising with incense smoke. These created a sensory environment meant to please the deity and stabilize the sacred moment. Music in ancient Egyptian religion had a quality of gentle intensity. It was not always loud or exuberant. At times it may have been soft, repetitive, and trance-like, almost like a steady lull to the divine presence. The temple could become a place where the body remembered rhythm and the ear followed devotion. In the background there would be the resonant stone, the shimmer of metal instruments, the smell of perfume and oil. Priests in such moments were not only administrators or guardians of texts, they were participants in a carefully tuned world of sound. In addition to daily service, priests were deeply involved in festivals, when the god's image might be carried out of the sanctuary and into public view. These were among the most vibrant moments in the religious year. The deity's procession could involve boats, palanquins, banners, incense, musicians, and crowds lining the streets or the riverbank. For a short time, the hidden god became visible, moving through the human world with ceremonial dignity. Priests were essential to these processions, managing the sacred object, guiding movement, reciting formulas, and keeping the ritual order intact. A festival could transform the temple from a place of quiet enclosure into a scene of communal excitement. Yet even in the midst of noise, the priestly role remained disciplined. Every step, every stop, every offering, every lift of the shrine was probably governed by tradition. We can imagine the late afternoon light on painted wood, the scent of lotus and sweat, the sound of cheering mixed with ritual chanting. Such occasions blurred the line between the divine and the civic, reminding everyone that religion in Egypt was not separate from public life, but woven into its annual pulse. The priesthood also had strong ties to astronomy and the calendar. Certain rituals had to be performed on particular days, and these days were not chosen at random. Egyptian priests observed the rising and setting of stars, the phases of the moon, and the seasonal cycle of the Nile in order to maintain the proper rhythm of worship. Time itself was sacred and had to be read with care. Some temple personnel may have specialized in this calendrical knowledge, helping determine when festivals should occur or which hours were favorable for certain actions. The sky, in a sense, became another sacred text. Its patterns told the priests when to act. This is one reason Egyptian religion can feel so intricately ordered. Divine activity, human labor, and cosmic cycles were linked together. A priest might stand at dawn, seeing the first pale light over the horizon, and understand that the day's ritual had to begin because the heavens had made their signal. The temple was not isolated from the sky. It was a place where celestial time entered stone walls, and where the movements above were mirrored in careful human behavior below. Not all priests lived in the temple all the time, and many had households, property, or local responsibilities outside sacred service. This makes the Egyptian priesthood especially interesting, because it was not always a completely separate caste. Some priests were prominent local elites who served the god, while also managing estates, family affairs, or civic obligations. Others may have depended on temple income, rations, or land rights granted in exchange for service. The result was a priestly class that could be socially varied and economically connected to wider society. Ancient evidence from inscriptions and documents shows that temple positions could be inherited, negotiated, and even politically valuable. A priest might gain status through service, but he might also use status to secure service. The temple thus sat at the intersection of piety and administration. One can imagine the layered life of such a man: the sacred linen put on at dawn, the return to a household by evening, the records kept, the taxes assessed, the family's future considered. The priesthood was not a sealed-off mystery. It was part of the ordinary machinery of Egyptian life, though elevated by ritual significance. In the later periods of Egyptian history, priestly institutions became increasingly sophisticated, and temple records show a strong concern with titles, ranks, and specialization. Some priests handled purity, others handled ritual speaking, others handled music, while still others took care of processions, sacred animals, or temple accounts. This specialization suggests both bureaucratic growth and a deepening complexity in religious institutions. The temple was becoming not just a place of devotion, but an administrative ecosystem. Different offices carried different honors, obligations, and perhaps pay. Scholars sometimes note that such developments varied by region and era, so it would be misleading to picture one single priestly structure across all of Egypt. Still, the overall impression is of an institution that kept refining itself over centuries. There was likely a strong sense of hierarchy, but also a practical need for many kinds of expertise. One priest might know the correct incense mixture, another the proper hymn, another the legal boundaries of temple land. Together, they maintained an ancient and highly organized sacred environment where tradition and paperwork could coexist in surprisingly intimate ways. Even with all this structure, priests in Egypt were still human beings living amid uncertainty, decay, ambition, and devotion. The temple promised order, but the world outside remained vulnerable to illness, drought, political change, and death. In that broader context, priestly service may have carried a profound emotional weight. To perform a rite correctly was to insist, for a moment, that the universe remained intelligible and balanced. The polished vessel, the fresh linen, the measured chant, the lifted offering, the closed shrine door, all of it participated in a continuing effort to renew creation. Egyptians may not have separated the sacred from the practical the way modern viewers often do. For them, the priest was not only a religious figure, but a stabilizer of reality. His work touched food, water, speech, time, body, and sky. And perhaps that is why these ancient temple lives still feel quietly compelling. Behind the grandeur of monuments and the mystery of carved walls, there was the everyday discipline of people who woke, washed, entered sacred rooms, and performed the same sustaining gestures again and again, believing that the world depended on such care. Training for priestly service in ancient Egypt was grounded first of all in careful knowledge of ritual, of sacred texts, of purity rules, and of the practical movements that filled temple life from morning to evening. A young person entering temple service would not simply learn a few prayers and then begin work. They would need to absorb a whole pattern of conduct, learning not only what to do, but how to do it in the correct order, with the correct wording at the correct moment, and with the correct posture of the body. Ancient Egyptian religion was deeply traditional, and continuity mattered. The rite procedure carried its own power, and exactness was valued alongside sincerity. In that sense, priestly training was not just instruction in belief, it was preparation for a disciplined way of being, one that joined speech, gesture, timing, and reverence into a single sacred practice. Many priests were skilled readers and writers, which set them apart in a largely non-literate society. Literacy in ancient Egypt was never universal, and the ability to handle written texts carried both practical and symbolic importance. Priests might study hymns, liturgical formulae, offering lists, calendar notes, and sequences of ritual actions preserved on papyrus or carved in temple spaces. These texts were not treated as mere records of what had already been done. They were part of the sacred technology of the temple itself, a way of preserving precise knowledge across generations and keeping ritual language stable over long periods of time. In a world where temples could serve the same gods for centuries, written tradition helped connect one generation of priests to another, so that the words spoken at an altar could remain strikingly old and therefore powerful. Yet memory also played a very large role. Not every ritual would have been learned by silently studying a manuscript in the modern sense. Some ceremonial knowledge was probably passed on through repeated observation, recitation, and correction, with an experienced priest guiding a younger one through the sequence step by step. A priest needed to know how a procession should move through narrow corridors, where a vessel should be held, when a cloth should be unfolded, when a door should open, and how many steps separated one chamber from the next. Even the pace of movement could matter. Ritual knowledge in Egypt lived in the body as well as in the text, and that bodily memory made the temple into a place of practiced precision. It is easy to imagine the quiet concentration of such learning, the same route walked again and again, the same formula repeated until it could be spoken without hesitation, the same gesture refined until it matched tradition exactly. The temple environment itself would have reinforced this learning in subtle and constant ways. Reliefs on walls showed offering scenes, divine processions, purification acts, and symbolic gestures, all arranged in ordered sequences. These images were not simply decoration, nor were they intended only to impress visitors. They provided a visual grammar for ritual life. Someone walking through the temple could absorb sacred patterns simply by looking around, almost as if the walls were teaching. In the dim light of a sanctuary or along the brighter spaces of an outer court, images of kings presenting offerings or priests purifying sacred objects would have surrounded the student with examples of proper conduct. The temple was therefore not only a workplace but also a kind of stone library, where instruction could be seen, remembered, and repeated in a quiet cycle of imitation. Egyptian priests also needed knowledge of sacred names, and this was another field where learning ran deep. The names of gods, their epithets, their local forms, and their mythic relationships all mattered. A deity could be approached in different aspects, linked to a particular temple, a season, a festival, or a function within the larger divine order. The same god might be praised through several names, each one bringing a slightly different emphasis. Priestly learning therefore included theology in a broad sense, even if the ancient Egyptians themselves would not have separated it into the categories used by modern scholars. To know a name was not simply to identify a being, it was to recognize a presence, a history, and a relationship. In ritual thought, speech was active, and naming could be a form of approach, a careful way of addressing what was unseen but intimately real. In some cases, priestly expertise extended into medicine, magic, and protective incantations. The boundaries between healing and ritual were not strict in ancient Egyptian life. A priest might recite a spell, prepare a remedy, and perform a ceremony as part of a single approach to care. This reflected a worldview in which spiritual and physical well-being were often understood together, rather than as separate realms. A headache, a fever, a fear of unseen harm, or a problem in the home could all call for words, substances, and ritual gestures combined. Priests were therefore not only attendants of the gods, but also custodians of help for the human body and household. Their learning could include knowledge of herbs, bandaging, purification substances, protective formulae, and the appropriate divine powers to invoke. The temple was not only a place of worship in this sense, it could also function as a center of ordered remedy and sacred care. There were likely degrees of access within temple learning, and not every priest would have known everything. Some knowledge was public, or at least broadly shared among those serving the temple, while other material was restricted to certain ranks or offices. Inner rituals may have been kept more secret, partly to preserve sanctity and partly to maintain authority and distinction. Secrecy was not necessarily a sign of mystery in the modern dramatic sense, but part of the atmosphere of the temple, creating depth, reserve, and hierarchy. Some doors were for many people, while others were for only a few. Some words may have been spoken only at certain times or in certain spaces. In this way, knowledge itself was organized like the temple architecture, layered, enclosed, and progressively more restricted as one moved inward. The instruction of priests would have been shaped by repetition, reverence, and correction. Ancient systems of learning often depended on exact imitation, and priestly work was no exception. A teacher could demonstrate the proper stance, the correct way to hold an offering tray, or the phrasing of a formula, while a learner repeated it again and again until it became natural. Small mistakes mattered more in this setting than they might in ordinary life. An error in an offering line or a purification step could be considered more than a minor slip. It might disturb the intended pattern of the rite, and in a religious world where order was highly valued, Such disturbance carried symbolic weight. That seriousness gives priestly education a distinct texture. It was careful, disciplined, and cumulative, built from small acts remembered correctly over time, with knowledge deepening through slow, exact practice rather than rapid explanation. This kind of training also shaped the character of the priest himself or herself where women served in temple roles. The learned person was expected to be composed, attentive, and controlled. A priest could not afford careless movement or casual speech when serving in a sacred setting. Even the way a person entered a room could matter. Such habits would have been formed gradually through a long apprenticeship in which the body learned restraint alongside the mind. Silence, in particular, may have held great value. Not every part of temple life required speaking. Sometimes the most important part was listening, waiting, or standing in a state of readiness. In that sense, priestly education was as much about inward discipline as outward performance. The temple school, if it is useful to imagine one by that name, would not have resembled a single classroom in the modern sense. Learning likely took place across many settings, in workspaces, in courtyards, near storehouses, beside shrines, and in the presence of older priests who already knew the routines. Some instruction would have been formal, especially when dealing with texts or highly regulated rites. Other lessons would have been absorbed almost incidentally through daily participation in the life of the temple. A novice might begin by carrying vessels, cleaning spaces, or observing senior priests before advancing to more sensitive duties. Over time, knowledge would accumulate layer by layer, with each new responsibility resting on the one before it. The sacred texts themselves may also have served as objects of devotion. To copy a hymn carefully or to recite a liturgical passage correctly was not just a technical exercise. It was a way of preserving divine order in human speech. Egyptian priests lived in a culture where language carried enduring force, and writing could fix that force in a stable form. A copied line was therefore not merely replicated information. It was an act of continuity, a bridge between an older ritual past and the present moment in which the gods were once again approached. This helps explain why accuracy mattered so much. The text was part of a chain, and that chain linked people, offices, festivals, and divine encounters across long stretches of time. At the same time, the temple was never wholly static. Although tradition was strong, it still had to be maintained in living practice. New priests replaced older ones. Local customs influenced temple usage. Festivals changed with political or seasonal conditions. So priestly training was not only about preserving fixed forms, but about learning how to keep those forms alive in a changing world. That required judgment, memory, and the ability to adapt without breaking continuity. A skilled priest knew when exact repetition was essential, and when a practical adjustment could be made without undermining the sacred structure of the rite. This balance between permanence and flexibility was part of what made temple service both demanding and stable. All of this gives priestly education a particular mood: quiet, concentrated, and patient. It was a world of measured repetition, of sacred words spoken carefully, of gestures made with deliberate precision, of knowledge passed from one generation to the next, in a setting shaped by walls, incense, water, linen, and controlled movement. The learning itself was a form of devotion. And once those skills were learned, they were put to use in a temple day that unfolded with measured quiet, as if each action had been rehearsed long before and could now take its place in the gentle order of the sacred hours. By the time a priest entered the inner life of an Egyptian temple, the idea of purity was not a vague spiritual feeling, but a carefully lived routine. Priests were expected to bathe often, sometimes several times a day, in order to approach the gods in a condition of ritual cleanliness. This was not simply about dirt in the ordinary sense. It was about removing the ordinary world from the body. River water, basin water, and the quiet rinsing of hands, face, and feet all belonged to a larger sacred rhythm. In the coolness of dawn, before the temple courts became active, a priest might wash in silence, then shave his body, trim his hair, and put on fresh linen. The linen itself mattered, because wool was often avoided in sacred settings, perhaps because it was associated with animals and decay. Egypt's priests, then, were not only functionaries of worship, but living embodiments of order, their daily grooming becoming a kind of prayer that could be repeated again and again without words. This sense of purity extended to diet as well, although the details are not always fully clear, because temple regulations changed over time and varied by region. Some priests seem to have avoided certain foods, especially fish or particular kinds of beans in some traditions, while others were restricted only during specific periods of service. Ancient writers from Greece, who observed Egyptian priestly life with a mixture of admiration and misunderstanding, described priestly diets as disciplined and selective. They ate in ways that emphasized control rather than excess. Bread, vegetables, fruits, and measured portions of meat may have appeared, but always under rules that linked the body to ritual acceptability. Food was not just nourishment, it was part of temple order. A priest's meal could be as meaningful as his words in front of a shrine, because both were governed by the idea that the body itself had to remain suitable for divine contact. In this way, everyday appetite was folded gently into sacred duty. Temple service also depended on time, and the priests of Egypt lived close to a structured sacred calendar. They did not simply appear whenever needed. Their work moved with the rising sun, the phases of the moon, festival days, and the seasonal cycle of the Nile. At certain moments of the year, temples would fill with processions, music, and offerings, while at other times the sanctuary remained quieter, almost enclosed in its own breath. A priest might know that a particular morning belonged to a god's awakening rite, while another day required the preparation of offerings for a festival procession. The movement of the heavens mattered too. Egyptian priestly knowledge included careful attention to stars and lunar timing, because divine activity was imagined to follow cosmic rhythms. So a priest was not just a guardian of statues or incense. He was also a keeper of time, helping the temple move in harmony with the larger architecture of the universe, as if every sunrise and every ceremonial offering were part of the same deep and repeating pattern. One of the most striking features of priestly work was the belief that a divine statue could be treated much like a living being. In many temples, the cult image of the god was not merely displayed. It was awakened, washed, clothed, perfumed, and offered food in rituals that mirrored care for a person of high rank. The priest performing these acts might open the shrine, speak sacred formulas, and gently present linen garments or perfume jars. Some scholars think these ceremonies emphasized the god's presence within the statue, while others caution that the image was also symbolic, a focal point for divine power rather than a container in any simple sense. But for the priest, the daily sequence was intimate and precise. He might uncover the figure, clean the small shrine with careful motions, and then close it again, all with a solemnity that turned maintenance into devotion. The room itself could be dim, scented with resin and incense, and lit only by filtered light. In such a setting, the priest's hands were doing something quiet but immense, sustaining a relationship between human hands and divine invisibility. Not all priests served in the same way, and Egyptian temple life contained layers of roles, ranks, and specializations. Some priests were responsible for reading ritual texts, others for purification, others for offerings, and still others for music, processions, or guarding sacred spaces. The term, often translated as priest, can hide this complexity, because ancient Egypt had an organized temple workforce with functions that were practical as well as spiritual. A scribe priest might preserve liturgies and copy hymns. A lector priest could recite spells and sacred instructions from memory or written rolls. Another priest might be attached to a particular deity's sanctuary and serve only during certain shifts. This meant the temple was not a single quiet chamber, but a living institution with its own hierarchy and rotation of labor. The sacred world was built through cooperation. One man prepared the offering table, another chanted, another managed incense, and another inspected purity. The result was a layered service in which the gods were honored through collective discipline rather than through a lone ceremonial figure. Priests were also keepers of sacred language, and this gave them an authority that reached beyond ritual performance. Many temple texts used a formal register of Egyptian, and over time priests preserved older spellings, archaic expressions, and literary styles that connected them to the deep past. Some texts were difficult even for educated Egyptians, which may have enhanced their sacred status. To recite them correctly was to step into an older voice, one believed to carry effectiveness across generations. The words themselves mattered, but so did pronunciation, rhythm, and exact sequence. A missed phrase could weaken a rite, or so the tradition implied. In this setting, memory became a kind of temple tool. Priests trained not only their hands and bodies, but also their tongues and minds. Their recitations might accompany offerings, funerary rites, and protective ceremonies in households or royal settings. In a culture where writing and speech were deeply intertwined with power, the priest's command of sacred language made him both a custodian of tradition and a participant in the unseen order of things. At certain temples, priests also engaged in astronomy and calendrical observation, activities that linked divine service to the motion of the skies. Egypt's sky watchers were attentive to stars, especially the heliacal rising of Sirius, which helped mark the new year and the flooding season of the Nile. The timing of important rites could depend on such observations. This does not mean every priest was an astronomer in the modern sense, but temple knowledge often included practical celestial awareness. The night sky was not empty above the temple precinct. It was a map of sacred time. A priest standing on a roof at dawn or consulting a calendar in the cool dark before sunrise would have participated in a tradition that connected stars to rebirth, renewal, and divine order. Some of this knowledge was likely passed through apprenticeship and long observation, and some of it remains partially hidden because surviving records are fragmentary. Still, it is clear that priests helped maintain a calendar that was at once agricultural, religious, and cosmic. The heavens and the temple were not separate domains, but carefully aligned halves of a single world. Although priests were often associated with purity and restraint, they also participated in festivals that were lively, crowded, and deeply human. On festival days, divine statues could be carried in processions, sometimes in boats or portable shrines, moving through temple courts or even into the streets. The atmosphere would change noticeably. The usual stillness of the sanctuary gave way to music, movement, smell, and voice. Incense drifted in the air, drums and sistrums might sound. People gathered to catch a glimpse of the god as priests lifted and guided the sacred bark or shrine. The ritual was not merely display, it was a form of divine accessibility, allowing the god to leave the inner sanctuary and encounter the living community. Priests organized these movements, regulated the pace, and protected the sanctity of the image amid the excitement. For the public, it could be a rare moment of closeness to divine presence. For the priest, it was a disciplined choreography, where every turn, pause, and offering maintained the balance between celebration and sacred restraint. Some priests were especially connected to healing, magic, and protective rituals, which reminds us that temple life in Egypt was never limited to formal offerings alone. Egyptian religion often assumed that health, fate, danger, and spiritual vulnerability could be addressed through ritual speech and sacred knowledge. A priest might prepare amulets, recite spells against fever or snakebite, or instruct a sufferer in protective rites. Temples could function as places of aid, not only of worship. This magical role was closely tied to the priest's reputation as a keeper of hidden knowledge. The same person who served a god at dawn might later, assist a petitioner seeking relief from illness or fear. Ancient Egyptian healing did not sharply separate prayer from remedy or ritual from practical treatment, and priests operated within that blended space. The air of the temple, with its incense and sealed rooms, may have contributed to the sense that invisible forces were being managed there. In a world where danger could feel omnipresent, the priest's words and gestures offered structured reassurance, a calm answer to uncertainty. There is also evidence that priests formed hereditary or semi-hereditary families in some periods, passing temple connections from parent to child. This did not mean every priestly office remained locked within one line, but family ties clearly mattered. Sons could follow fathers into temple service, learning the routines of purity, recitation, and administration from an early age. Daughters too could occupy religious roles in some contexts, especially in temple music, chant, or elite cultic service, though their exact positions varied over time. Such continuity would have made temple life feel stable, almost domestic in its own way, despite the grandeur of the sacred setting. A child growing up around temple walls would hear hymns before fully understanding them, and would absorb the cadence of ritual life as something ordinary and profound at the same time. This kind of inheritance helped preserve tradition, but it also meant that priesthood was not always a distant abstraction. It could be woven into family identity, with discipline, memory, and sacred duty handed down quietly like a treasured and carefully folded linen cloth. As much as priests served the gods, they also served the temple itself as an institution, which meant managing wealth, storage, land, and labor. Temples in Egypt could own fields, livestock, workshops, and granaries. They received offerings and tribute, redistributed goods, and supported a network of workers and dependents. Priests often participated in this administrative life, recording inventory, supervising deliveries, and ensuring that offerings reached the correct shrines. Their work was therefore not only ceremonial but economic. A temple could resemble a small city of sacred management, with scribes, craftsmen, porters, cleaners, gardeners, and ritual specialists all coordinated under priestly oversight. This practical dimension is easy to overlook when thinking only of incense and hymns, yet it was essential. The gods required bread, beer, linen, oil, and flowers, and those offerings had to come from somewhere. Priests helped turn the resources of the land into sacred maintenance. Their work linked harvests to holiness, storage rooms to sanctuaries, and accounting tablets to ritual continuity, all in the patient service of keeping divine presence active and fed. And beneath all these visible duties, there remained the quiet mystery that no historian can fully resolve: what it felt like day after day to live as a priest in ancient Egypt. The surviving records tell us about duties, titles, purification, offerings, and temple routines, but they cannot completely capture the inward texture of belief. Perhaps a priest felt awe every time the shrine opened in darkness, or perhaps routine and reverence blended so thoroughly that the sacred became as ordinary as breathing. Perhaps the repetition of washing, dressing, chanting, and offering gave life a steady calm, as if the temple were a vessel carrying its servants through time. The incense would rise, the linen would rustle, the words would be spoken with practiced care, and the god would remain both distant and near. In that balance of certainty and mystery, labor and devotion, the priests of Egypt shaped a world where the daily act of service could feel like a small echo of creation itself. In the temples of ancient Egypt, the priest was often expected to be clean not only in body, but in sight, scent, and social conduct. One of the most striking details preserved by ancient writers is the practice of shaving the head and body. This was not simply a matter of appearance. In a hot climate, with incense smoke drifting through courtyards and sacred rooms, the removal of hair may have been seen as part of ritual purity, a way of setting the priest apart from ordinary life. Some priests wore wigs in ceremony, while others kept their heads closely shaven beneath linen caps, creating a deliberate contrast between natural human form and purified temple presence. It is easy to imagine the quiet routine of this grooming: water poured into basins, bronze razors catching the light, and linen cloths folded nearby. The exact rules varied by period and temple, and not every priest likely followed the same standard at all times, but the broader idea is clear enough. The priest's body itself became part of the ritual landscape, prepared and maintained so that sacred work could proceed without interruption, in an atmosphere of order that the Egyptians valued deeply. That concern for purity extended far beyond shaving. Priests were commonly expected to wash repeatedly, especially before entering holy spaces, and they often wore fresh linen rather than wool. Linen, with its pale and breathable texture, suited both the climate and the symbolism of cleanliness. Wool, by contrast, was often associated with impurity in priestly contexts, perhaps because it came from animals and could retain grease and odor more readily. Ancient temple service may therefore have begun with a sequence of washing, dressing, and careful preparation, the kind of ritual routine that could slow the breath and settle the mind. Some sources suggest that priests bathed more than once a day, though the exact frequency almost certainly differed from one place to another. The point was not hygiene alone, even if hygiene mattered. It was the creation of a condition that separated temple life from the ordinary world outside, where dust, sweat, and daily labor were unavoidable. In that quiet cleanliness, the priest was thought to become a fitting vessel for divine service, as if the body itself had been tuned to a more refined and orderly pitch. Another important feature of priestly life was a carefully regulated diet. Ancient sources and later interpretations suggest that priests avoided certain foods, particularly fish in some contexts and perhaps beans, onions, or other items in specific local traditions. The evidence is not always consistent, and it is likely that food rules changed across temples and periods, but the general idea of dietary restriction is well supported. A priestly meal may have been simple, measured, and governed by purity concerns rather than appetite. Bread, fruit, and carefully prepared offerings could form a quiet daily fare, and the temple itself, with its storehouses and kitchens, would have controlled much of what was eaten. This discipline in eating was not a minor detail. It reflected a broader conviction that the priest should not be entangled in every common habit of ordinary life. Food, like clothing and washing, was part of ritual identity. In a world where divine order was believed to permeate the visible and invisible alike, even the contents of the stomach could matter. There is something almost meditative in imagining these meals, taken without hurry, in measured portions, under the watchful rhythm of temple custom. Although priests were devoted to service, they were not all identical in rank or function. The priesthood included a range of roles, from high-ranking temple leaders to lower-ranking ritual attendants who might serve by rotation. Some priests were responsible for the inner sanctuaries, while others managed offerings, chant, incense, or sacred vessels. There were also temple administrators, scribes, musicians, and staff whose work supported the religious center, even if they were not priests in the narrowest sense. Within the priesthood itself, titles could be highly specific, sometimes tied to a single god, a particular temple, or a defined ritual duty. This layered structure suggests a living institution rather than a static class. A temple was not simply a place of prayer. It was a complex household of sacred labor, with tasks that had to be distributed, recorded, and remembered. Some priestly offices may have been hereditary, while others were assigned or rotated among qualified men. In later periods, especially, the priesthood could resemble a bureaucratic world of schedules and responsibility. Yet beneath the administrative order remained the quieter spiritual goal: to keep the gods served, the rites correct, and the sacred world in balance through regular human care. A priest's day could therefore follow a pattern as precise as the movements of the sun itself. At dawn, there might be washing, dressing, and the opening of the shrine. The god's statue or cult image, kept in darkness overnight, could be awakened symbolically with hymns, incense, and offerings of food and drink. Doors might be unsealed, curtains parted, and the scent of resins released into the air. This was not theatre in the modern sense, though it certainly had ceremonial beauty. It was an enacted relationship between human keepers and a divine presence believed to inhabit the temple. Later in the day, offerings would be renewed, sacred objects tended, and the shrine carefully closed again. Some of the strongest evidence for this comes from temple inscriptions and ritual texts, though much still remains inferred from fragments. What is clear is that the temple was treated as a living environment with its own daily rhythm, and the priest was the one who helped maintain that rhythm. The repetition of these acts, done in the same order again and again, may have provided a strange and calming continuity, as dependable as the turning of a slow lamp flame in a quiet room. The priesthood also had a deep connection to music and spoken formulae. In many Egyptian ceremonies, song, chant, clapping, and the rhythm of instruments helped shape the sacred atmosphere. Women sometimes served as singers or chantresses in temple contexts, especially in relation to certain goddesses and ceremonial processions, though their roles varied widely. For male priests, spoken words were never merely spoken. Names, prayers, and ritual statements could be considered powerful actions in themselves. To recite correctly was to participate in order to keep the divine pattern intact. A hymn may have been chanted in a measured voice while incense curled upward, or a ritual formula repeated over an offering table with deliberate care. The sound of it must have carried through stone halls in a softened, resonant way. Temples were not silent places, but neither were they loud. They were filled instead with controlled sound, the kind that fades into the architecture and then returns lightly from the walls. For the priest, language itself was part of devotion, and the careful shaping of words was as important as the gesture of the hand. Some of the most intriguing details about Egyptian priests come from the intersection of religion and astronomy. Certain temple priests were responsible for observing the stars or maintaining calendars, linking sacred ritual to the heavens. The Egyptian year had to be organized around seasons, festivals, and the rhythms of the Nile, and priestly experts played a major role in keeping track of these patterns. The rising of Sirius, for example, was deeply significant in Egyptian chronology and religious thought, though the exact local traditions differed. In this way, priests were not only guardians of shrines, but also custodians of time. Their knowledge could involve observation from temple rooftops, the marking of hours, and the regulation of festival days. This gave priestly work a quiet intellectual dimension. It was not only about incense and offerings, but about measurement, prediction, and the reading of recurring patterns in the sky. One can picture a priest standing in the cool hours before sunrise, watching the eastern horizon darkly brighten, aware that sacred time was not abstract at all, but woven directly into the movement of stars, water, and season. There is also evidence that priests took part in healing practices, though here the boundary between priest, physician, and magician could become beautifully blurred. In ancient Egypt, illness was often understood through both physical and spiritual causes, and priestly specialists might recite spells, use amulets, or perform ritual actions intended to restore balance. Temples dedicated to healing gods, such as Sekhmet or Imhotep in later periods, were associated with therapeutic traditions that combined medicine and sacred intervention. Some priests may have prepared remedies using plants, minerals, and careful prescriptions, while others focused on protective recitation. The surviving texts do not always let us separate clinical treatment from religious healing in the modern sense, because the two were not sharply divided in Egyptian thought. A priest could be both reciter and caregiver, both interpreter and intermediary. The atmosphere of such work may have been gentle and grave, with cool jars, measured words, and the smell of herbs mixing with temple incense. Even when the details remain uncertain, The picture suggests that priestly service reached beyond the sanctuary wall and into the needs of living bodies, especially bodies in distress. Priests also played a role in funerary religion, which was one of the central concerns of ancient Egyptian civilization. Funeral rites, offerings to the dead, and the maintenance of tomb cults required specialized knowledge and regular performance. Some priests served specifically in relation to mortuary temples or ancestral commemorations, ensuring that the dead received sustenance in the afterlife through spoken formulas and symbolic offerings. The most famous of these ritual specialists was the lector priest, often associated with the reading of sacred texts during ceremonies, though his exact duties could vary. In tomb and temple alike, words had endurance. Names needed to be spoken, offerings renewed, and the dead remembered in the proper way so that they could continue in a blessed state. This gave priestly labor a remarkable continuity across generations. The living priest was not only serving a present God, but also participating in an economy of remembrance that linked the present to ancestors long gone. It is a deeply human idea, perhaps one of the most enduring in history, that care for the dead is itself a form of order, and that ritual memory can keep presence alive in a quiet, lasting way. The temple economy likewise depended on priests, who were often involved in the management of land, granaries, livestock, and offerings. Temples in Egypt were not just spiritual centers, they were economic institutions with considerable resources. Grain harvests, herds, workshops, and storage facilities all connected to temple life. Priests and temple officials would have overseen inventories, recorded deliveries, and organized the redistribution of goods. This administrative side of priestly life is less romantic than incense and hymns, but it was essential. A god's house needed bread, beer, textiles, oil, and vessels. It also needed planning. The temple workforce could include craftsmen, farmers, scribes, and servants whose labor made ritual possible. Thus, the priestly class stood at the meeting point of sacred and practical worlds. The sanctuary depended on accounting, and accounting itself was folded into sacred duty. That blending may seem surprising from a modern perspective, yet in ancient Egypt it was entirely consistent with the idea of ma'at, the principle of ordered balance. To manage supplies well was, in a quiet sense, to serve cosmic stability. Finally, it is worth remembering that the priesthood was not a fixed, unchanging institution across all of Egypt's long history. What a priest did in the Old Kingdom was not exactly the same as what a priest did in the New Kingdom or the late period. Political changes, foreign influences, temple expansions, and shifts in religious emphasis all altered priestly life over time. Some temples gained enormous wealth and power, others diminished. Some priestly offices became highly formalized, while others remained local and traditional. Even the appearance of priests may have changed slightly, from clothing styles to ritual accessories, though always within the larger vocabulary of linen, purity, and sacred service. This long evolution reminds us that priesthood in Egypt was not a single frozen image carved in stone. It was a living tradition, adaptable but rooted, changing yet recognizably itself. And across all those centuries, one quiet thread remained: the priest as the one who stood between human life and divine presence, maintaining the ceremonies that allowed the world, in Egyptian thought, to continue in balance day after day in the steady light of dawn. By the time we look closely at the daily life of Egyptian priests, one of the most striking things is how much of their work depended on purity, but also on routine. A priest was not simply someone who stood before a god at rare festivals. He was part of a carefully managed system of service that tried to keep divine space orderly, clean, and awake in a sense that ordinary life was not. In many temples, priests bathed more than once a day, shaved their bodies, and changed into linen garments that were meant to feel light and unstained. The emphasis on linen was not accidental. Linen was associated with freshness, with cleanliness, and with a kind of restrained brightness under the sun. It was also practical in the Egyptian heat. The records and images that survive suggest that the ideal priestly body was controlled, disciplined, and quiet, as if the person serving the god should not bring the disorder of the outside world into the sacred enclosure. That concern for order continued in the way priests moved through temple space. Temples in Egypt were not open public halls in the way many later religious buildings became. They were layered, restricted places where each zone held a different level of sanctity. A priest might begin his day in the outer areas and move gradually inward, passing through gates, courts, and halls that grew dimmer and more private. The deeper one went, the more the temple seemed to leave the ordinary world behind. Scholars often describe these structures as processional machines, places built for movement and sequence as much as for worship. In the stillness before dawn, or in the cool of early morning, a priest carrying oils, water, or incense could have seemed like a small figure walking through a stone landscape of shadows and columns. Much of the temple would remain silent, except for steps, murmured prayers, and the soft sound of ritual objects being handled with care. One of the most important parts of priestly life was the daily awakening of the god's statue. The deity's image was not treated as a mere symbol in the modern sense. In Egyptian religious thinking, the statue could become a divine body, a dwelling place for the god's presence, and so it had to be cared for like a living being. Priests would open the shrine, purify the space, remove the remnants of the previous day's offerings, and then present new clothing, oils, incense, and food. These acts were repeated with remarkable consistency, and that repetition was itself meaningful. The god was not being entertained so much as sustained, refreshed, and ritually re-established in the world. To modern ears, the idea may sound ceremonial and distant, but for the Egyptians it expressed a very practical theology. The universe needed maintenance, and the temple was one of the places where that maintenance happened. This careful service extended to the objects priests used. Ritual instruments were often handled as if they were alive with the significance of their purpose. Vessels for water, incense burners, ceremonial knives, scepters, and offering trays all belonged to a system in which form mattered deeply. A vessel's shape, material, and polish could all carry meaning. Some tools were made of precious metals or carefully selected stone, while others were simple but purified through ritual use. Hand of the priest mattered too. A hand that had washed, shaved, and entered the temple according to proper rules was not the same as an ordinary hand. It had been prepared to touch sacred things. Even the act of carrying an object from one space to another had ritual weight, because movement itself could be part of the offering. The temple thus became a world of controlled gestures, where nothing was casual if it touched the divine. Priests were also closely connected to knowledge, especially knowledge of words. Hymns, prayers, and ritual formulas were not improvised in the way a modern speaker might improvise a blessing. They were memorized, preserved, and passed along as treasured forms. In some periods, priestly training included writing, reading, and the careful copying of sacred texts. This was especially important because Egyptian religious language was often conservative, preserving older expressions long after everyday speech had changed. A priest might recite words whose roots reached back generations or even centuries, and the sound of those words was considered part of their power. The written sign and the spoken formula were linked. To read a sacred line correctly was to participate in a chain of tradition that connected the present temple to its long memory. In this way, priests acted not only as servants of the gods, but as guardians of inherited speech. The priesthood, however, was not a single simple class. It included many ranks and roles, some temporary and some hereditary, some highly specialized and some more local. There were pure priests, lector priests, wab priests, and others whose titles reflected duties that could involve chanting, purification, carrying sacred emblems, or managing temple storage. At larger temples, the hierarchy could be quite elaborate, with senior priests overseeing juniors and administrators, supervising the enormous economic and ritual life of the institution. This complexity matters because it shows that Egyptian temples were not only places of worship, but also major centers of administration. They controlled land, workers, cattle, grain, workshops, and records. A priest could therefore be both a ritual specialist and a man of business, moving between sacred recital and practical accounting with little sense of contradiction. For ancient Egypt, managing the temple's resources was part of maintaining cosmic balance. That balance depended as much on festivals as on ordinary daily service. On special days, the god's image might leave its inner shrine and travel by sacred boat or procession to another part of the temple, or even beyond it, to meet other gods, receive offerings, or be seen by the public. These occasions brought color, noise, and excitement into a setting normally marked by restraint. Music, chanting, perfume, and movement transformed the temple into a lively ceremonial world. Yet even in festival time, the priest's role was to guide, not to dominate. The god was the true participant. The priest was the trained mediator. Reliefs from temple walls suggest that such events could be emotionally rich, though the surviving evidence often leaves us uncertain about how much ordinary people understood of the deeper theology. What is clear is that festivals created moments when the hidden divine world briefly touched the visible one, and priests were the ones who helped that meeting happen safely. There is also a quiet but important dimension to priestly life in the way it was tied to lineage, learning, and family memory. In some periods, priestly office passed through families, and children grew up around temple spaces, hearing sacred speech and watching ritual order from an early age. Yet hereditary continuity did not mean complete exclusivity. New men could rise into priestly roles through service, favor, education, or royal appointment. This gives us a more flexible picture than the simple idea of a closed caste. Priesthood in Egypt could be deeply rooted in kinship, but it was also shaped by state power and temple politics. A family might preserve a role for generations, while a king could elevate a loyal official or reorganize temple personnel for political reasons. The temple was therefore not just a spiritual place, but a living institution where ambition, continuity, and duty all had to be carefully balanced. Another feature of priestly life was the strong concern with time. Egyptian temples did not merely operate at random hours. Their rituals were linked to the daily cycle of sunrise, noon, and sunset, as well as to lunar months, calendar festivals, and seasonal changes in the Nile's behavior. The rising sun itself had deep theological meaning, and morning rites often mirrored the reappearance of divine order after the darkness of night. The temple could be understood as a place that helped the sun rise again in a ritual sense, just as it helped the god remain present through proper care. Some priestly duties may have been adjusted according to the time of year, the condition of the river, or the schedule of feast days. This meant that priests lived within a layered sense of time, one that was at once practical and cosmic. Their work was not only about doing the right thing, but doing it at the right moment, in harmony with cycles larger than any human life. The clothing and adornment of priests also tell us something subtle about how sacred authority was displayed. White linen is most commonly associated with priestly purity, but there were also distinctive headgear, collars, sashes, and sometimes animal skins worn in particular contexts. The famous leopard skin garment, for instance, appears in some images of special ritual roles, especially for lector priests or those performing powerful ceremonies. To modern viewers, such garments may seem theatrical, but in Egyptian thought appearance carried significance. The body of the priest was part of the ritual message. It had to be marked as separated from everyday labor, from dirt, from conflict, and from ordinary appetite. The stillness of the costume reinforced the stillness of the office. Even when a priest was moving briskly through temple tasks, his clothing declared that he belonged to a different order of activity, one set apart for the gods. And yet, despite all this separation, priests were not untouched by the world outside the temple walls. They lived in society, dealt with officials, responded to political shifts, and sometimes served in local communities beyond their ritual duties. Some were attached to specific gods whose cult centers were major cities, while others worked in smaller regional temples where local devotion shaped the rhythm of worship. In times of change, priestly institutions could be affected by royal reform, foreign rule, or economic stress. Temples accumulated wealth, but they also depended on that wealth for their own functioning. Offerings had to be produced, transported, and stored. Granaries had to be kept secure. Workers had to be supervised. So the priestly world, though cloistered in many ways, was never sealed off from the world of harvests, taxes, diplomacy, and labor. It was a quiet center, but not an isolated one. All of this gives the Egyptian priesthood a character that is both intimate and immense. On one hand, it was built from small repeated acts: washing, dressing, opening a shrine, speaking a formula, placing bread, burning incense, and making sure the god's room remained pure. On the other hand, those acts were tied to a grand vision of stability that extended across the kingdom, the seasons, and even the movement of the sun. The priest was someone trained to attend to the smallest detail because the smallest detail mattered in maintaining the largest order. In surviving inscriptions and temple scenes, we often see only fragments of this life, just enough to suggest the rhythm of it. A doorway, a vessel, a lifted hand, a line of offering text, a figure in linen moving through a dim hall. And in those fragments, the daily devotion of Egyptian priests remains quietly present, as steady as breath in the dark. In the temples of Egypt, the priest was often more than a servant of a god. He could also be a guardian of rhythm, a keeper of schedule, a person whose days were arranged around the invisible order that held the cosmos together. One of the most quietly important parts of priestly life was the calendar. The temple year was not a loose or casual cycle. It was carefully observed, linked to stars, seasons, river levels, festivals, offerings, and sacred awakenings. Priests watched the sky for signs of timing, and they watched the land for changes in flood and harvest. In this way, their work joined heaven and earth. A festival might begin at dawn, or at the appearance of a star, or on a date that remembered a mythic event far older than the priest himself. This close attention to time gave Egyptian religion a feeling of precision and patience. The temples were not only houses of worship. They were also places where time was measured, interpreted, and renewed in a steady sacred pulse. That concern with sacred order reached into the smallest gestures of a priestly morning. Before entering the inner temple, priests often washed themselves carefully, shaved portions of their bodies, and changed into clean linen. These actions were not merely practical. They were symbolic, and they also created a distinct bodily discipline. The clean linen, light in the heat, would have felt cool against the skin. The shaved head and body may have reduced lice and dirt, but they also marked a separation from ordinary life. Egyptian priests were expected to approach the divine without the heaviness of daily labor, without the smells and residues of the outside world. Purity was not always moral in the modern sense. It was ritual, physical, and atmospheric. One can imagine the quiet of a temple service, the sound of water pouring into basins, the rustle of linen, and the sense that every motion had to be gentle and exact. For the priests, cleanliness itself became a language of reverence. Some priests were associated with very specific forms of knowledge, and among the most fascinating of these was medicine. In Egypt, the boundary between priest and physician was often soft. Temple personnel could read spells, prepare remedies, and perform healing rites that combined practical observation with sacred recitation. A priest might examine symptoms, prepare herbal treatments, and then speak words that called on a god for protection or restoration. The body and the spirit were not sharply divided in Egyptian thought, so illness might be seen as something physical, spiritual, or both. Papyrus texts preserve many examples of remedies and incantations. And while not every temple priest was a healer, the wider priestly world clearly included men trained in medical law. This gives a sense of how deeply the temples participated in everyday life. They were not remote sanctuaries only for kings and gods. They were also places where people sought relief from pain, hope for recovery, and reassurance that the unseen world could still respond kindly to human suffering. The priesthood also had a strong relationship with language and especially with recitation. A great deal of Egyptian temple work depended on speaking correctly. Words were not just descriptions, they were forces. To recite a hymn, to speak the name of a god, to pronounce an offering formula, all of these were believed to have effect. This is one reason scribal training mattered so much in priestly circles. Many priests were learned men, and some were expert readers of sacred scripts that ordinary people could not easily decipher. The writing system itself, with its elegant signs and layered meanings, added a feeling of mystery to temple life. A priest might copy texts by lamplight, memorize long liturgies, and learn which words belonged in which rite. Even silence could be important because speech had to emerge at the right moment and in the right form. For a modern listener, this can feel very still and delicate, like listening to an ancient chant carried softly through a stone hall. It is also worth noticing how temple priests were woven into the political life of Egypt, even when they seemed far removed from it. Some high priests held tremendous local influence, managed estates, supervised workers, and advised rulers. Temples were wealthy institutions, with land, livestock, granaries, workshops, and storehouses. A priest in charge of these resources was not just performing ritual. He was part of a large administrative system. In some periods, especially when central authority weakened, powerful priests could become nearly state-like figures in their own regions. Yet even in such cases, their legitimacy often depended on service to the gods. Egyptian kings presented themselves as the main mediators between the divine and human worlds, but priests helped carry out that sacred kingship on a daily basis. Their authority came from tradition, learning, and ritual competence. In a sense, they helped translate royal ideals into the ordinary language of temple routine. Not all priests lived the same life, and the priesthood itself was diverse. Some served full-time in large temple centers, while others were attached to smaller shrines or performed duties only at certain times of the year. There were specialist roles, including those who sang, those who prepared offerings, those who handled sacred vessels, and those who read from ritual books. The division of labor inside a temple could be intricate. This meant that priestly service was not a single identity, but a layered social world. Some priests may have been wealthy and influential, while others served in modest local capacities. In some cases, priesthood could even be hereditary, passed within families, preserving expertise across generations. That kind of continuity created an atmosphere of memory. A son might follow a father into service, learning the same hymns, the same gestures, the same routes through temple courtyards and storerooms. The temple, then, was not only a place of worship, but also a place where knowledge was inherited slowly, like a warm lamp handed from one hand to another. Among the more moving aspects of priestly life was the care given to cult statues. Egyptians often treated the divine image as a living presence, not just a carved object. Priests washed, dressed, perfumed, fed, and adorned these statues according to strict ritual routines. In the dim light of an inner sanctuary, the statue might receive fresh linen or jewelry, or be carried in procession during festival days. The act of dressing a god created a deeply intimate ritual atmosphere. It joined human tenderness with cosmic significance. Some scholars think these rites emphasized the god's ongoing vitality. Others caution that the exact meaning may have varied by temple and by period. But the material reality is clear enough. The priest's hands were central. He touched sacred fabric, polished surfaces, lifted offerings, and maintained the god's visible presence. To imagine this is to imagine not spectacle but care. The temple was a place where attention itself became holy, and where the smallest act of maintenance had theological weight. Egyptian priests were also guardians of sacred space, and temple architecture reinforced that role. As one moved deeper into a temple, the floors might rise or fall, the light might thin, and the walls might close in more tightly around the path. Outer courts were more open and accessible, while inner chambers belonged to stricter ritual control. Priests knew how to move through this layered environment, what areas were restricted, and what moments called for special restraint. The building itself taught hierarchy. A visitor would have sensed that progression immediately: birds and dust and sun outside, then shaded halls, then near darkness, then the hush of the sanctuary. Priests moved with confidence in these spaces because they belonged to them. Their bodies knew where to pause, where to turn, where to present an offering, and where to remain silent. In this way, the temple was like a living map of sacred order, and priestly service was a form of navigation through that map, performed day after day until the gestures became almost like breathing. The funerary realm was another area where priests played an important part. Some priests were involved in mortuary rites, tomb offerings, and the maintenance of the dead's cult. Egyptians believed that the deceased could continue to need food, water, remembrance, and ritual support. This meant that a priest might stand not only in a bright temple court, but also in a tomb chapel or near an offering stela, speaking formulas that renewed life beyond death. There were priestly roles connected with embalming and with the ceremonies that transformed a dead body into a suitable vessel for eternal existence. These duties must have carried a solemn atmosphere. They linked the living community to ancestors and to the gods who governed the afterlife. In a culture where memory had sacred force, the priest helped ensure that the dead were not abandoned to silence. Instead, they remained part of a larger network of giving, speaking, and returning. The priesthood also offers us a glimpse of how carefully the Egyptians thought about sensory experience in religion. Perfume, incense, oil, sound, texture, and temperature all mattered. Frankincense and myrrh, when available, would have filled the temple with sweet, resinous smoke. Linen felt smooth and clean. Gold and polished stone caught the light in certain chambers, while carved reliefs created shifting shadows as the sun moved. A priest's sandals or bare feet in some ritual contexts would make different sounds on stone floors. Even the air inside a temple might have seemed cooler and heavier than the heat outside. These details were not accidental ornament. They helped create an environment in which divine presence felt plausible and immediate. For ancient worshippers, the gods were not abstractions. They were approached through the body. The priest was the one who mediated that bodily encounter, and so his training had to include not just doctrine or myth, but the art of making a place feel sacred. Finally, it is important to remember that much of what we know about Egyptian priests comes from fragments, inscriptions, temple scenes, papyri, and later interpretations. The picture is detailed in some places and hazy in others. We know quite a lot about major temples, priestly titles, ritual purity, and festival life, but much less about the private thoughts of individual priests or the full range of local practice across all centuries. The evidence often reflects elite settings, formal ideals, and the best preserved monuments, which means real life may have been more varied, more improvised, and sometimes more human than the surviving record shows. That uncertainty is part of the beauty of the subject. The priests of Egypt emerge not as flat stereotypes, but as figures seen through layers of time. Some wealthy, some humble, some learned, some practical, some devoted to reading stars, others to washing floors, shaping offerings, or protecting sacred images. Their world was ordered and mysterious at once, and even now it retains that calm, distant glow, as if the temple lamps were still burning somewhere beyond the edge of memory. In the late temple world of Egypt, a priest's authority did not begin and end with ritual alone. It often depended on a careful command of language, especially when that language was written in a way that only a trained minority could read. Hieroglyphs, hieratic and later Demotic script all had their own domains, and priests moved among them with quiet skill. Some inscriptions were meant for the gods, carved with formal precision on stone walls that caught the desert light. Other texts were more practical, written on papyrus in faster script for accounts, instructions, and temple administration. This meant that many priests were not simply ritual specialists, but also archivists, record keepers, and guardians of memory. In a temple storehouse, among baskets of linen and jars of oil, a priest might also keep lists of offerings, festival calendars, or copies of sacred compositions that needed careful recitation. Their literacy gave them access to a world most people never touched directly. And yet, even within this educated circle, knowledge was often shared gradually, with older priests teaching younger ones through repetition, correction, and long practice. The slow discipline of reading and copying sacred words was itself part of the priestly life, a kind of devotion that joined intellect to reverence. This closeness to writing also shaped the way priests preserved religious tradition over centuries. Temple texts were not all fixed in the modern sense of a single final version. Many survived through copying, adapting, and renewing, so that a hymn or ritual formula could carry traces of older language even as it was used in later times. Priests were often the ones who maintained that continuity. They may have copied an ancient spell from an earlier manuscript, but the copy would also reflect the orthography, theology, and local habits of their own period. In that sense, priests were not just repeating the past, they were actively mediating it. They decided what to preserve, what to abbreviate, and what to explain through marginal notes or parallel versions. Some temple libraries likely contained a mixture of sacred literature, ritual manuals, mythological narratives, astronomical records, and medical texts, all organized according to the needs of the cult. The atmosphere of such places can be imagined as cool and dusty, with the smell of papyrus, resin, and old plaster, and with silence broken only by reading aloud. A priest in training would have learned not only the words themselves, but the rhythm of sacred knowledge as something breathed, memorized, and carefully handed on. Among the priestly duties that remain especially vivid in the historical record is the care of divine images. In Egyptian temples, the statue of the god was not treated as a mere decoration or symbol in the modern sense, but as a living focus of presence. Priests washed, dressed, anointed, and fed these images with great regularity. The daily service could feel intimate and restrained, almost domestic in its rhythm, though its meaning was cosmic. The shrine doors would be opened at dawn, the statue purified, and fresh linen might be placed upon it with deliberate hands. Offerings of bread, beer, meat, incense, flowers, and natron might follow, depending on the temple's resources and the deity's local tradition. The care of the image reflected the care of the god's body, and by extension the care of the world itself. If the deity was properly tended, order remained strong. If neglect or impurity entered the temple, it was believed that balance could weaken. This is one reason priestly service was so exacting. It was not enough to perform a gesture in a general way. The correct formula, the correct material, and the correct moment all mattered. These actions created a ritual atmosphere that was both tender and formal, like a household preparing for the arrival of an honored and unseen guest. Yet the temple was also a place of active economy, and priests participated in it with a practicality that may surprise modern readers. Offerings brought to the gods did not simply vanish into incense smoke. Some were consumed in ceremonial meals, some redistributed among the priesthood, and some managed as part of the temple estate. Large temples owned land, employed workers, stored grain, and maintained herds. Priests could oversee fields, supervise deliveries, and keep track of harvests. In periods when temple wealth was strong, these institutions were effectively major economic centers. Their authority depended partly on this material base, because feeding the god also meant sustaining the personnel and infrastructure required to preserve the cult. Lists from different periods suggest a careful division of labor within temple households, with bakers, brewers, gardeners, cleaners, craftsmen, and scribes all supporting the sacred complex. The sounds of such a place would have included not only chanting and hymn recitation, but the quieter noises of daily administration. Seals pressing into clay, reed pens scratching on papyrus, baskets being moved, water poured into jars, grain measured out in careful portions. In this setting, priesthood was not removed from ordinary life. Instead, it shaped and organized it, creating a bridge between sacred service and the practical rhythms of food, labor, and storage. As powerful as temples could be, their internal structure was often surprisingly organized and hierarchical, with duties assigned according to rank, rotation, and specialization. Not every priest performed the same work every day. In many periods, especially from the New Kingdom onward, priestly service was divided into rotations so that different groups would take turns being on duty at the temple. This system helped manage purity requirements and spread the workload among many individuals. It also meant that a priest might serve for a time and then return to his home, agricultural work, or administrative obligations before coming back again. Such arrangement created a flexible priesthood, one that could be tied to local communities while still maintaining the temple's round-the-clock ritual needs. Higher-ranking priests, such as the chief priest or the overseer of the temple, had responsibilities that extended beyond ritual performance into management, mediation, and communication with state officials. Lower-ranking priests might specialize in music, purification, guarding the sanctuary, or carrying sacred objects. The result was a social world in which rank was visible, but roles were interdependent. No one part of the system stood alone. The quiet precision of the whole depended on many hands, many trained memories, and many cycles of repetition. The priestly world also included women in ways that varied greatly by time, place, and deity. Female religious roles in Egypt were not identical to the male priesthood, but they were important and sometimes highly visible. Women could serve as chantresses, singers, musicians, and ritual participants, particularly in temples dedicated to goddesses or in ceremonies connected to divine fertility and sacred celebration. Some elite women held titles associated with the god Ammon or with temple service more broadly. In earlier and later periods alike, sacred music was often a female sphere, with women shaking sistrums, singing hymns, and contributing to the sensory richness of temple ritual. The soft metallic sound of a sistrum, bright and rhythmic, would have accompanied processions and festivals in honor of deities such as Hathor. There is still scholarly debate about the exact scope of some female titles, because texts can be ambiguous and local customs varied. Even so, it is clear that women were not entirely absent from priestly life. Their presence reminds us that the temple was not a sealed male domain, but a layered social institution in which voices, gestures, and ritual labor could cross gender lines in complex ways. In devotional settings, song and movement could become forms of priestly service as meaningful as any spoken formula. Priests also played a key role in festivals, and these public celebrations gave ordinary people rare glimpses into sacred space. On such occasions, the hidden god might leave the sanctuary in procession, carried in a shrine or bark, and accompanied by chanting, percussion, incense, and crowds gathered in expectation. The route might pass through temple courtyards, along avenues of sphinxes, or even out into the town. Festival calendars could include processions connected to the flooding of the Nile, royal jubilees, local deity feasts, or seasonal rites of renewal. Priests prepared these events carefully, polishing sacred vessels, cleaning the bark, dressing statues, and rehearsing the sequences of movement and song. For the people watching, the festival was both a religious event and a moment when divine favor seemed to cross visible boundaries. Some participants may have come seeking healing, blessing, or the answering of petitions. Others came for the beauty of the ceremony itself, with its colors, scents, music, and measured movement under bright sun. The priest's role during festivals was therefore not confined to the secluded interior of the temple. It could become public, ceremonial, and even theatrical, though always within a framework of solemn order. Through these processions, temple religion touched the wider social world, and the god's presence was made tangible in motion. Another striking dimension of priestly culture was its relationship to medicine and healing. In Egypt, the boundaries between religious and medical knowledge were often porous. A priest could be a ritual expert and also a healer, especially in contexts where illness was thought to involve both physical and spiritual causes. Some temple specialists preserved spells, remedies, and diagnostic texts that combined practical treatments with invocation of divine assistance. An ailment might be addressed through honey, herbs, bandaging, massage, or other material means, alongside spoken formulas designed to repel dangerous forces or restore harmony. Gods such as Sekhmet, Thoth, and Isis were associated with healing, and priests devoted to their cults may have served as intermediaries in therapeutic rituals. The priestly healer was not necessarily seen as opposing medicine and magic, because in Egyptian thought these categories could work together. A remedy could be effective precisely because it addressed the body and the unseen forces affecting it at the same time. In temple settings, this expertise would have been especially valuable, since sacred knowledge was often expected to encompass the protection of life as well as the service of the god. The result was a priestly identity that extended beyond altar and offering table into the quieter, urgent work of easing pain and restoring balance. Astronomy and timekeeping were also deeply embedded in the priestly profession. The Egyptian calendar demanded careful observation of celestial cycles, seasonal change, and ritual timing. Priests watched stars, tracked lunar phases, and marked the hours of night using specialized instruments and traditions. The night sky, in particular, held religious significance, since the movement of stars could be used to regulate temple service and to understand the order of the cosmos. Certain priests may have been trained in star charts or lists of decanal stars, the groups of stars used in timekeeping across the night. These observations helped determine when rituals should begin, when offerings should be made, and when particular festivals should occur. In this way, priestly work was tied to the heavens as much as to the temple floor. One can imagine a roof terrace at night, warm stone slowly cooling, with a priest looking upward across the dark, recording the position of a star as the desert air settles around him. Such activity brought together piety and precision. The sky was not distant or abstract. It was a sacred calendar, a living pattern through which divine order could be read. Even if not every priest specialized in astronomy, the wider priestly culture relied on those who could interpret the heavens and translate them into ritual time. Priests were sometimes also custodians of morality, though Egyptian religion did not usually frame this in the same confessional way found in later traditions. Purity, truth, balance, and appropriate conduct were central concepts, and priests embodied these ideals by maintaining bodily cleanliness and ritual correctness. They shaved their bodies, washed frequently, avoided certain foods or materials at specific times, and observed rules of abstinence before entering sacred areas. These practices were not simply about hygiene, though they certainly had hygienic effects. They also expressed a state of readiness and separation from disorder. The priest's body itself had to become fit for the presence of the god. This emphasis on purity may have been especially visible in temple service performed at dawn, when the body was cool from washing and the air carried the scent of natron, water, and linen. Different temples and periods likely had different strictness, and historians sometimes disagree about how universal certain rules were. Still, the broad pattern is clear. Priesthood in Egypt demanded disciplined self-presentation. It was a way of living that turned ordinary acts, such as bathing, shaving, dressing, and eating, into repeated signs of sacred fitness. Through these habits, the priest's life became an ongoing preparation for contact with the divine. At the same time, the priestly class was never entirely separate from politics. High-ranking priests could wield enormous influence, especially in times when central authority weakened or when a temple's wealth made it a major local power. The chief priest of a great cult center might negotiate with officials, control estates, oversee large staffs, and shape public religious life in ways that affected broader society. In some periods, priestly offices were linked to elite families, creating hereditary networks of power and prestige. This did not mean that every priest was politically active or that every temple functioned like a government. But it does mean that the priesthood could become deeply entangled with administration, landholding, and state ideology. A temple might serve as a place where the legitimacy of a king was celebrated, renewed, or ritually confirmed. Priests could proclaim divine favor while also helping manage the concrete institutions that made such favor visible. The world of ancient Egypt was one in which religion and governance often overlapped, not in a confused way, but in a carefully structured one. The priest stood at that overlap, part servant, part scholar, part administrator, and part ritual witness. And in the stillness of temple chambers, with incense rising in thin streams and sunlight narrowing across carved walls, that layered role gave Egyptian priesthood its enduring, quiet complexity. By the later periods of Egyptian history, the priesthood had become much more than a religious office. It was also a learned profession, a social identity, and in many places a stable route to influence. Priests preserved temple routines, maintained sacred texts, and kept alive traditions that stretched back across centuries, even when kingdoms rose and fell around them. In some eras, especially when central royal power was weaker, powerful temple institutions could hold enormous landholdings and administer workers, storage facilities, and herds. The priest's place was therefore not only in front of a shrine, but also within a wider economy of offerings, distribution, and record-keeping. Surviving inscriptions sometimes suggest that temple personnel formed a world with its own hierarchy, its own obligations, and its own carefully guarded forms of knowledge. To stand inside such an institution would have meant moving through ordered spaces, listening to familiar rhythms of ritual, and knowing that sacred duty and administrative responsibility were often woven together in the same day. Among the most important shifts in the history of Egyptian priesthood was the way temple service could become specialized and hereditary. In many periods, the sons of priests followed their fathers into the same institutions, learning ritual recitations, purity requirements, and temple customs from childhood. This did not mean every priest came from exactly the same background, but it does suggest a tendency toward continuity, where temple life was passed down like a family craft. Such continuity may have helped preserve liturgical knowledge over long stretches of time, especially in a civilization where written tradition mattered so deeply. A young priest in training would likely learn by watching older men, memorizing long lists of offerings, and absorbing the correct order of actions at each festival. The result was a profession that could feel both intimate and ancient, as if each generation were carefully receiving a lamp already burning. Egypt's great temples depended on that kind of inheritance because the gods were served not by improvisation, but by exact remembrance. Even so, the priesthood was not entirely uniform. There were many grades, titles, and responsibilities, and the same person might move through different roles as he advanced. Some priests were attached to daily offerings, while others were specialists in ritual language, music, astronomy, or sacred protection. Certain titles suggest a division between those who performed hands-on cultic duties and those who were more closely associated with reading texts, guarding archives, or overseeing temple property. Egyptian sources can be frustratingly selective, and scholars still debate the precise meaning of many priestly titles, especially when they appear in different dynasties or regional cult centers. Yet the overall picture is one of complexity rather than simplicity. A temple was not just one sacred room, but a whole inhabited environment with kitchens, magazines, workshops, courtyards, and staff. Within that world, a priest might spend part of his life tending incense and part of it managing supplies of grain, cloth, oil, or natron. The sacred and the practical were not opposites, they were neighbors. One of the most distinctive features of Egyptian priestly life was the discipline of purity. Priests were expected to present themselves in a state fit for approaching the divine, which meant abstaining from certain foods, regulating bodily cleanliness, and keeping the body carefully prepared for ritual contact. Water, shaving, washing, and linen garments all played a role in this system of sanctity. The details changed over time and from temple to temple, but the broad ideal remained remarkably consistent. The priest had to become, in effect, a person set apart. This separation was not always about moral purity in the modern sense. It was often about ritual readiness, about ensuring that the god's cult image and sacred space were not approached carelessly. The repeated washing, the removal of hair, the careful donning of fresh linen, all created a quiet transformation before service began. One can imagine the stillness of a temple chamber in the early morning, the coolness of the stone floor, the scent of water and incense, and the deliberate movements of men preparing themselves before the first words were spoken. The daily temple service itself was built around repetition, and repetition was a form of devotion. Priests opened shrines, washed or anointed cult statues, presented food and drink offerings, and recited formulae that renewed the relationship between God and temple community. In a sense, every morning recreated the world. The ancient Egyptian belief in cyclical renewal was deeply present here. The sun rose, the god awoke, the offerings were brought, and sacred order continued. Although the full sequence varied by cult, many temples followed a rhythm that linked human action to cosmic maintenance. The statue of the deity was not treated simply as an object, but as a divine presence made accessible through ritual handling. Incense smoke rising in narrow shafts of temple light would have added to the atmosphere, carrying scent into enclosed spaces and softening the edges of the day. For the priest, these acts were not dramatic in the theatrical sense. They were careful, measured, and exact. The power lay in doing the same sacred things again and again, with unwavering attention. Festival life, by contrast, could be expansive, noisy, and public. While daily temple service often remained hidden from ordinary people, festivals brought the god out into processions, barks, ceremonial streets, and crowds of spectators. Priests carried sacred vessels, guided images, sang or chanted, and maintained ritual order amid movement and celebration. Such festivals connected temple life to the wider population and allowed communities to see the gods not only as distant powers within sanctuaries, but as active presences moving among the living. In some places, festivals included music, drums, dancing, feasting, and offerings made by households eager to participate in divine favor. Yet even in the midst of this outward energy, the priest's role was to preserve structure. He ensured that the procession remained ritually correct, that the god was handled properly, that the route and timing followed tradition. It is easy to imagine the contrast between the private stillness of inner sanctuaries and the bright vitality of festival days, when sunlight, color, and movement gathered around the temple in layers of ceremony. Priests also served as guardians of sacred knowledge, and that knowledge extended far beyond spoken prayers. Egyptian temples were among the great repositories of literacy in the ancient world. Priests copied texts, studied ritual handbooks, maintained lists of offerings, and preserved mythological, astronomical, and medicinal material. Some of the most prized knowledge seems to have been linked to divine names, protective spells, calendrical calculations, and the proper wording needed for ritual efficacy. Because writing itself had an aura of power, The priestly scribe occupied a special place within temple culture. He was not merely recording things already known. He was helping sustain the world through exact textual performance. Scholars still explore how widely such texts circulated and how much knowledge remained restricted within temple circles, but there is no doubt that priestly literacy was one of the foundations of Egyptian religious continuity. In a quiet archive room, with bundled papyri, reed pens, and the dry scent of old materials, the priest scribe would have embodied a form of memory that was both practical and sacred. The relationship between priests and animals also reveals much about Egyptian religious life. In many cults, sacred animals were understood as manifestations, companions, or symbols of divine presence. Some temples kept living animals associated with particular gods, and priests were responsible for feeding them, protecting them, and performing the correct rites around them. In other cases, animal mummification and burial became important expressions of devotion. Priests could oversee these preparations, linking the life cycle of the animal to the cultic life of the deity. The meaning of sacred animals could be complex and local, varying from one temple center to another, and modern readers should resist reducing them to simple symbols. For the Egyptians, animals were part of the divine landscape, capable of carrying meaning, power, and presence in ways that were immediately felt rather than merely explained. A priest moving quietly among enclosures or burial chambers would have encountered a world where feathers, fur, movement, and stillness all participated in religious significance. Even the act of care could become a ritual expression. Women also played priestly roles in certain Egyptian traditions, though their responsibilities and visibility varied widely across time. The best-known female priestly titles include roles such as chantress or singer, especially in connection with goddess cults and temple music. Some elite women served in major sanctuaries, sometimes with high status and ceremonial importance. In earlier periods, royal women could hold religious offices that linked them to temple authority, while later times show more clearly defined female participation in musical, ritual, and devotional roles. The evidence is uneven, and the exact day-to-day duties of many priestesses are not always fully recoverable, but it is clear that temple religion was not an entirely male domain. Women's voices, gestures, and presence contributed to sacred performance, especially where music and liturgical praise were central. One can imagine the layered sound of such ritual spaces: men reciting formulas, women singing refrains, instruments marking time, and all of it flowing through halls decorated with reliefs and painted scenes. In that environment, sacred service was shaped not only by rank, but by harmony. Temples themselves were carefully oriented and symbolically designed, and priests inhabited those architectural meanings every day. A temple was not just a building for gathering people. It was a sacred model of the cosmos, with gates, pylons, courts, hypostyle halls, and inner sanctuaries arranged to guide movement from brightness to darkness, from public access to divine secrecy. The priest's journey through the temple could therefore feel like a passage from the ordinary world into the concentrated presence of the god. Light diminished as one moved inward. Sound softened. Walls carried carved scenes of offerings, royal authority, and divine protection. Each space had its own purpose and atmosphere. Scholars often point out that temple architecture helped reinforce ritual hierarchy, making the movement of priests and offerings part of a larger symbolic logic. The temple was not simply the backdrop for religion, it participated in it. To walk those corridors at dawn carrying incense or water was to travel through a landscape of meaning, one that had been designed to slow the body and focus the mind. Priestly life in Egypt also had a close relationship with time itself. The calendar of rites, feasts, lunar observations, and seasonal festivals required careful attention to celestial and agricultural cycles. Some priests had roles connected to astronomy or timekeeping, watching stars, calculating dates, and ensuring that festivals occurred at the correct moment. In a land where the rivers flood, the sun's path and the agricultural year all shaped survival, sacred timing carried immense importance. The priest's concern with exact dates was not abstract. It helped synchronize human action with divine order and natural change. Even the opening of a shrine or the lighting of lamps could depend on precise timing. This attention to time created a subtle rhythm in temple life, one that linked morning and evening, month and season, year and dynasty. The priest, in this sense, was a custodian not only of a god's house, but of the proper unfolding of sacred time. And perhaps that is one reason temple service could feel so calming. Everything had its place, and every place had its hour. In the end, what stands out most about the priests of Egypt is their extraordinary commitment to continuity. Across long stretches of history, through political changes, foreign rule, and shifting theological emphasis, they maintained a culture of ritual exactness, textual memory, and sacred responsibility. Their world was not frozen, but it was deeply anchored. A priest might pray in a language shaped by older forms, handle objects made generations earlier, or recite words whose origins were already ancient when he learned them. He served a God whose house linked heaven, earth, and the underworld, but he also lived among taxes, food supplies, family obligations, and the ordinary tasks of temple administration. That combination of the lofty and the everyday gave Egyptian priesthood its enduring character. It was a life of measured steps, quiet discipline, and repeated acts of care. And in the soft hush of a temple before dawn, with lamps still low and the air cool with stone and incense, that care may have felt like one more way of helping the world remain in balance.